floor to my lead co-sponsor, Senator Warren of Massachusetts, with my thanks to her for her leadership in protecting American consumers and for her help in drafting this measure. It is a privilege to serve with Senator Warren in the Senate. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Massachusetts.
I want to start by commending Senator Whitehouse for his extraordinary leadership. For 5 years, he has worked on this issue. He proved from the very beginning that he was open to consumer groups that came to talk to him about a problem, and that he has been committed to helping working families, that has been his central goal. It is a great honor to stand this afternoon, with Senator Whitehouse and to talk about a bill that can advance that goal, helping working families. You know, Mr. President, for more than 2 centuries, a state could pass a usury law and enforce it against anyone who was lending money in the state. Congress and the federal agencies played a central role in our banking policies, but our system allowed states to play an important role too. The states decided locally what were the highest interest rates they wanted their citizens to be charged. We honored the traditions of federalism, and things worked pretty well. The states protected their citizens. Consumer financial products like credit cards were easy to understand, and they were safe for consumers. They were not loaded with tricks and traps. That changed starting in 1978 when the Supreme Court issued its decision in Marquette National Bank of Minneapolis versus First of Omaha Service Corp. In that decision, the court interpreted a banking law that Congress had passed back in 1863, and they decided that the statute meant that the states could not keep an out-of-state lender from charging high rates within the state. Now, that all sounds pretty technical, but the result was that credit card companies flocked to move their headquarters to states that had little consumer protection. Then other states raced to the bottom, repealing their consumer protection laws, hoping to attract more business to their state. The basic idea that states could protect their citizens from whatever tricks or traps the banks wanted to try simply disappeared. So I rise today to join my colleague from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse, to introduce the Empowering States' Rights to Protect Consumers Act. This bill will restore the ability of states to enforce their own rules against all lenders that do business within the state. It does not tell states what rules to put in place. It lets states decide for themselves. The Credit Card Act, enacted in 2009, and the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, created by the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, were critical steps in the right direction, and they are doing a good deal to help protect consumers. But we need to recognize the value of state partnerships by empowering our states to play a role too, and by restoring their ability to serve as a laboratory of democracy. If and when credit card companies develop the next generation of tricks and traps buried in fine print and legalese, states ought to be able to respond with their own rules and protections if they deem it necessary. I ask my colleagues to carefully consider this bill. I say again to Senator Whitehouse, thank you for your extraordinary leadership on this. It is a great honor to stand today and co-sponsor this bill with you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama.
Are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Mr. President, we just saw the news today that GDP, according to the Wall Street Journal, for the first quarter was revised downward dramatically from previous estimates. One of the largest revisions you'd ever see I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the accounting, but they go back and double-check their numbers and add other analysis, and they come up with what the growth of the economy was in the first quarter. The previously announced growth level was 2.4% for the first quarter, which is low. We need to, coming out of a recession, need to be doing better than that. But now that it was revised downward, they found there's only 1.8% growth first quarter. That's a very dangerous trend, and they said, the article said, it's evidence of a slowing growth in America. The fourth quarter of last year, GDP growth was only 0.4%. If continued throughout the year, that's a very troubling number. And the data shows that for the last 15 quarters, almost 4 years, we've averaged only about 2% growth in our economy, growth in GDP. So I just would say, colleagues, as we vote to bring in more and more workers at a time when jobs are not being created of any significant number, we need to be aware that that could cause severe consequences. The Atlanta Federal Reserve economic study they did several years ago found that the immigration flow today in the Atlanta area of the Federal Reserve there had reduced the wages of American workers in that region by as much as $1,500 a year already, and that's $120 a month. Less money for the average family to take care of themselves. Unemployment, declining wages are one reason, a big reason people get in trouble on their credit cards. Professor Borjas and others have done studies on this. Another study found that $960 decline in people's annual wage, which is about $80 a month. $80 a month may not sound like a lot for a senator, but it sounds like a lot for a working American. Maybe equal their gas bill or part of it. So I just would say that, Mr. President, that as we consider our votes on the immigration bill, let's consider that this economy is not growing. It's not creating large job growth. We have projections that we're not going to do so for the next decade, and we ought not to overload the economy with a new flow. Now, I'm not talking about the people that will be legalized that are here, but a new flow that's much larger than the current flow of immigration legally. I thank the Chair. I see my colleagues are here, and I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in the morning business to offer unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it has now been 95 days since the Senate passed a budget, and I've come to the floor myself now 6 times to request a unanimous consent to move to conference. Now, my Democratic colleagues have requested unanimous consent to move to conference another 8 times, and after every request, a Senate Republican has stood up and said no to the opportunity to work on a bipartisan budget deal. Mr. President, I'd like to say to the Republicans who are blocking a bipartisan budget conference, enough is enough. We have heard so many excuses, refusing to allow a conference before we get to a so-called pre-conference framework, putting preconditions on what can be discussed in a bipartisan conference, claiming that moving to a budget conference, which leading Republicans did call for just a few months ago, was somehow not regular order, to most recently claiming that we need to look at a 30-year budget window before looking at the major problems we've got right now in front of us, which I'd add is just unacceptable because the American people rightly expect us to work on both at the same time. Mr. President, hearing these changing excuses week after week has been really, really frustrating, not just for Democrats, but for many of my Republican colleagues as well. A large group of us, Republicans and Democrats, think that although we do have major differences between the party's values and priorities, we should at least come to the table and try to work out a bipartisan deal. That's what American people do every day. And when there's a disagreement, they can't afford to just play a game of chicken and hope the other person gives in, because when that happens, important things cannot get done. The kids don't get picked up from school, bills don't get paid, small businesses miss a major opportunity for expansion. Every day, regular Americans avoid those kinds of situations, and we here in the Senate should at least try to do the same. Mr. President, there are extremely important things that are not getting done in the Senate right now because some Republicans want to embrace the harmful top-line spending level and sequestration, which have a major gap between the House and Senate appropriations levels for the next fiscal year. And we just don't have much time left to resolve that gap. After we come back from next week's state work period, we'll just have 1 month to try to come to an agreement, or else we're going to find ourselves in a very tough situation in September. We could, once again, be working against the clock to avoid a harmful crisis. Mr. President, the last thing the American people who come together and resolve differences every day want to see is another round of a manufactured crisis coming out of Washington, D.C., and they do not have to. We still have time. I know there are leaders on both sides of the aisle who would strongly prefer to solve problems rather than to get into yet another political fight that creates uncertainty for our families and our businesses and our country and our economy. I'm confident that if those of us who prefer common sense bipartisanship over artificial crises work together, we can reach a fair agreement and show the American people that our government does work. So I urge Senate Republican leaders to drop the Tea Party-backed strategy of delaying until the next crisis and allow the Senate to join the House in a formal bipartisan budget negotiation. And therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 33, H-Con Res 25, that the amendment which is at the desk, the text of S-Con Res 8, the budget resolution passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof, that H-Con Res 25, as amended, be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table, that the Senate insist on its amendment, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and the chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate. Following that authorization, two motions to instruct conferees will be in order from each side: a motion to instruct relative to the debt limit and a motion to instruct relative to taxes and revenue. There will be 2 hours of debate equally divided between the two leaders or their designees prior to votes in relation to the motions, and that no amendments be in order to either of the motions prior to the votes, all of the above occurring with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection to the request?
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
reserving the right to object. The issue before this body is not complicated. There's a lot of procedural ambiguities that make it difficult to penetrate, and yet at its heart it's one very simple issue. The issue before this body is whether the United States Senate can raise the debt limit of the United States with simply using a 50-vote threshold, or whether it should go through the regular order before raising any debt limit, subject to a 60-vote threshold. Now, what is the difference, Mr. President? The difference is simple. If the debt limit can be raised using 50 votes, then the majority party, the Democrats, do not need to speak to the Republicans, do not need to sit down at the table and work with the Republicans, do not need to listen to any opposing views, and indeed, the President of the United States has been very candid. He's been unequivocal. President Obama has said that he believes we should raise the debt limit with no preconditions, with no negotiations, with no changes whatsoever. Mr. President, if you think it's okay that in 4.5 years our nation's debt has gone from $10 trillion to nearly $17 trillion, if you think it's okay that our nation's debt is now larger than the size of the entire economy, if you think it's okay that our children and grandchildren are being bankrupted, in 4.5 years the national debt has grown over 60%, and if you think it's okay that the Senate Democrats want to continue borrowing trillions more while doing nothing, not a zilch, to address the spending problems, to rein in out-of-control spending, then you should welcome this motion. Over and over again, the majority has asked to go to conference on the budget. Why? Because going to conference on the budget allows a procedural backdoor to enable them to raise the debt ceiling using only 50 votes. Now, how do we know that's what this is really about? Well, Mr. President, we know that's what this is really about because my friend, the senator from Washington, could go to conference on the budget right now. This instance, we could go to conference on the budget right now, except when I ask, as I'm going to in a moment, for unanimous consent not to use it as a procedural backdoor to raise the debt ceiling, my friend, the senator from Washington, is going to object. And I know this because we've done this kabuki dance more than once, and we continue doing it back and forth. But it makes clear that's what this fight is all about. Now, of course, the Senate budget didn't address the debt ceiling. The House budget didn't address the debt ceiling. We didn't have a debate on the floor of this Senate about the debt ceiling. We didn't have a vote on the floor of the Senate about the debt ceiling. And yet, the reason the majority is so adamant that they want to go to conference is because it presents them with an avenue to use 50 votes, the votes of only the Democrats in this body, to raise the debt ceiling, to dig us further in debt, and to do nothing, nothing, nothing to fix the problem. Mr. President, I would suggest that's irresponsible. That's not what Americans want. It's not what Democrats, Republicans, or independents outside of the Washington Beltway want. Americans, look, we fundamentally know it is wrong to stick our kids and grandkids with $17 trillion in debt. And it's even more wrong to keep on doing it and making it worse and worse and worse and not roll up our sleeves to fix things. Mr. President, one of the great frustrations of this body is that for some time now the American people have been unequivocal. Their top priority is jobs and the economy, is turning around what's going on, and yet this body doesn't talk about that. It doesn't talk about generating jobs, getting the economy growing, stopping our out-of-control debt. Instead, we debate every other priority under the sun, whether it is restricting Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, or whether it is a national energy tax through the President's climate change proposal.
I'm not sure whether there's been an objection or not.
Reserving the right to object, I ask unanimous consent that the senator modify her request so that it not be in order for the Senate to consider a conference report that includes reconciliation instructions to raise the debt limit.
Mr. President, I would object to that.
Is there objection?
Because what the senator is asking for is a precondition on a conference committee without the consideration of this full Senate. What I have offered to him and to this body in my unanimous request is a vote on a motion to instruct conferees, which is what occurs in the Senate if we want to put any preconditions on to a budget. So I reject
Would
his
the senator
unanimous
yield for a
consent,
question?
and I would move again for my unanimous consent and ask consent.
Would the senator yield for a question?
I've asked
Does
unanimous consent.
the senator from Washington object?
The senator from Washington
To the
objects.
request is modified.
The request is modified and re-ask for my original motion to instruct.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, I would note that the comment from my friend from Washington suggesting a motion to instruct the conferees, what she of course knows is that's a typical Washington maneuver because the motion to instruct is non-binding and it is subject to 50 votes. So if we had a motion to instruct the conferees not to raise the debt ceiling, every Democrat in this body would vote against it. It would be defeated. And even if it were passed, it would be non-binding on the conferees. No one should be confused. What the Democrats want is to raise the debt ceiling, and they want to do it just using 50 votes, ignoring the views of the minority and doing nothing to fix the problem. Accordingly, I object.
My unanimous consent.
Is there objection?
I
The original motion. Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was here to talk about immigration, and that is what I will talk about, but I have been caught in the crossfire on this subject. I just want to say, you know, my view is this is exactly what people hate about Washington, D.C. It's exactly why we have a 10% approval rating for 4 years I went to town hall meetings and was asked over and over and over again in these town hall meetings, why don't the Democrats in the Senate pass a budget? Which I think is a very legitimate question. And we got a new chair of the Budget Committee, and we passed a budget after 4 years, and now we're told we can't go to conference to have a discussion with House Republicans about what our budget ought to look like. And I actually disagree with the Senator from Texas, I have to say respectfully, on the merits of this issue. That is to say, on the debt ceiling itself. And this is the reason I think folks in Colorado can't stand this place. There's not a mayor in my state, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat or a Tea Party mayor, not one, who would threaten the credit rating of their community for politics. Not one. We'd run them out on a rail because that's not the way you do business. The credit rating of a community is the most important thing that it has. The full faith and credit of the United States of America, which until the last debt ceiling discussion had never been questioned, was questioned for the first time in our history. Not because of the size of our debt, which, by the way, I've spent 4 years trying to work on because I believe it is a severe problem that we face, very severe problem that we face. I look forward to working with the Senator from Texas on this issue. But because of the political dysfunction in D.C. That's why we got this downgrade. The senator from Alabama who's left the floor was talking about the restatement of our GDP numbers in the first quarter. I worry a lot about that. You know, the people I represent, they're not concerned with the procedural stuff that goes on here. What they're worried about is an economy that they're living in day after day after day, where even in periods of economic growth, median family income is falling. Middle-class families are falling behind. They're worried about an economy where they're earning less at the end of the decade than they were at the beginning, but their cost of higher education continues to escalate. Their cost of health care continues to escalate. And as individuals, as families, and as members of a generation, they're worried that we're going to be the first generation of Coloradans and Americans to leave less opportunity, not more, to the people that are coming after us. That's what they're... I would like to finish my statement, and then I will gladly yield for a question. So I was glad to hear that the Senator for Alabama, he and I disagree on the immigration bill, but we certainly agree on the issue of the concern that all of us have for this economy, or most of us have about this economy, and it's one of the reasons we should pass this immigration bill. The Congressional Budget Office tells us that we would see 3 additional points of GDP increase in the first 10 years, 5 over the 2 10-year windows if we pass the bill. And to the point about American jobs, I was very glad to hear him say he wasn't talking about the 11 million people who are here, because most of the 11 million people here are working. But they're working in a shadow economy, a cash economy, under circumstances where they can be exploited. And we've allowed that to happen because of the broken immigration system that we have. If all you cared about, and I deeply care about, was rising wages for the American worker, you would want to bring those 11 million people out of that shadow economy. You'd want them paid in something other than cash, and you'd want them, for heaven's sake, paying taxes at a time when we've got the kind of deficit problems that the Senator from Texas is describing. Now, the Senator also talked about the future flow of immigrants, and I should say I was part of this bipartisan group. This is not a partisan bill, this immigration bill. There were 8 of us, 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats, who worked together on this bill, and one of the things we thought hard about was the future flow of immigrants to this country, because generation after generation of Americans, since the founding of our country, have relied on new immigrants to bring their ideas, to bring their talents, to bring their energies to our shores, to build their businesses here. Today what we're saying to people is, even people that get college degrees in the United States that we subsidize, that we pay for, even those people we're saying, don't stay here. Even if you want to stay here, please go home to China and start your business there. Go home to India. Compete with us from there. Go hire people there instead of creating jobs here in the United States. We are a nation of immigrants. We subscribe to the rule of law. And this bill is a ratification of those two American ideals, ideals that you can almost not find in any other country in the world, which is why I am so glad that for once this body is actually acting in a bipartisan way to deal with not an easy problem, but a tough problem. Because I'll tell you what, the kids that are visiting today from 4-H all across the country and from my state of Colorado actually are expecting us to do these hard things, as our parents and grandparents did before them, so we don't leave them in the lurch. That's what's at stake here. And that's why I wish we could find a way past this budget impasse as well, so we actually could start to have a responsible conversation about what we're going to do on the entitlement side and on the revenue side, so that we don't continue to hack away at domestic discretionary spending in ways that could lead us, with some of the House proposals, to invest only 4% of the revenue we collect in the future. 4% in transportation and agriculture and education. There's not a business in this country that would last a year if it invested 4% of its cash flow in the future of that business. So at some point, we've got to move beyond where we've been here and actually get into a serious discussion about how we're going to manage this debt down over the next decade or two in ways that don't prevent us from growing our economy and in ways that don't subject our children to unpaid bills. It would be as if I went to the mortgage lender on my house and I said, I'd like to buy a house and I'm going to take out a mortgage and then I'm going to give it to my kid to carry for me instead of paying for it myself. That is the position we're in today. And the only way we're going to solve that is if Democrats and Republicans can sit down together and actually move past the talking points. Mr. President, with that, I'll yield for a question.
If I may ask my friend two questions on the two topics that he addressed, the first being the debt ceiling and the second being immigration. And on the debt ceiling, the question I would ask is, does my friend from Colorado believe that Congress should continue raising the debt ceiling in perpetuity with no changes and no preconditions, and should the Senate be able to do so with just 50 votes?
Here's how I answer that. I appreciate the question through the chair from the Senator from Texas. It's clear that this is not going to get us anywhere, this procedural fight that the two of you are having every couple of weeks. I mean, I think that's clear. I think it's clear that the debt ceiling is something that's been raised time and time again by Republicans and by Democratic presidents over the years. And I think it's also clear that we have to deal with our debt and our deficit. I believe that. But for myself, I don't feel like I would come to the floor and say, I'm only going to allow this bill to go to conference with Republicans in the House if all the money comes to Colorado, or some other stipulation that I would want that 99 other senators wouldn't agree with. The second thing is that I think it's important for people to understand is that this issue, and again, I am not in any way trivializing the issues around our deficit and our debt. And I want the Senator from Texas, I hope he understands that, I hope he knows that about me. But I worry about the debt ceiling as a tool of accomplishing this, first for the reasons that have to do with our credit rating, but also because there's a view among some that the debt ceiling is about bills that we are going to incur as opposed to the ones we already have incurred. In other words, I don't think if somebody were at home and said, I mean, it'd be one thing if somebody said, you know what, I'm spending too much money, I'm going to cut up my credit card. And that's what they would do. But that's not what the debt ceiling is about. What the debt ceiling is about is somebody saying, you know what, I want the best cable package I can find. I want the best satellite package that I can find. And when the bill comes to pay for it, I'm just going to chop it up into little pieces and not pay it. That's what I don't like about this approach, but everybody's entitled to their own approach on this question. I just wish we could move forward here, instead of continuing to earn the 10% approval rating that Congress has. That's all I'm asking for.
Would the Senator yield to an additional question on that point? I like and agree with your analogy of cutting up the credit card. And indeed, if my friend from Colorado indeed supports anything resembling Congress cutting up the credit card, that would truly be a dramatic position and a position on which he and I could find common cause. And so I would ask, if I could ask a question and then, I would ask, the natural result of what my friend from Colorado just said is that I assume then that he would readily support Pat Toomey's Default Prevention Act. And what Pat Toomey's Default Prevention Act does is it ensures the scenario you said, money that we've borrowed, we will keep paying. Pat Toomey's Default Prevention Act says in the event that the credit limit is not raised, the United States will always, always, always pay its debt. We will never, ever, ever default on the debt, and we'll take that completely off the table. And so then the debt limit fight would only be about, as my friend from Colorado put it, cutting up the credit card for future spending. And so I would ask, would my friend from Colorado support the Default Prevention Act, making it impossible, taking default off the table permanently?
I say through the chair to my friend from Texas, I haven't read the bill, but I will read the bill, and I'll commit to you that I will do that. It is, and I appreciate, I think, the implication of this, which is that you're not objecting to my metaphor about the cable bill being cut up, because I do think that is a real problem here. I mean, we're not saying to people, when we shouldn't be saying to people here, that we're going to behave in that irresponsible way. As somebody who used to spend his time restructuring companies that were really well run, really well operated, but had horrible balance sheets, I'd have to think hard about, the treatment that the creditors would provide to, in this case, the United States government when I looked at that, and I will look at that. And I would say to the senator from Texas that there are other things that, we might even be able to agree on, too, around here. I mean, I, for a long time, have thought that it would be important for us to put health care on a budget in this country. It's just, we're not on a budget. And during the health care debate, I had an amendment, I think, called the Fail-Safe Amendment that would say to the American people and to the United States Congress, this is what we have to spend on health care, and that's all there is. There isn't any more. We have to manage toward that. And if we failed, if we tripped over it, then we'd have to actually make cuts, make changes to our system of health care. We spend twice as much as any other industrialized country in the world, and it's crowding out a lot of other things that the 4-H kids and others that I worry about care about. So I think there are plenty of things that we can work on, but I just don't think we're going to get to it through this kind of discussion. We might get through it through this kind of discussion. So, in any event, I will commit to the senator from Texas that I'm going to sit down and stop talking about what he said.
Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask the quorum call be initiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. There's no one else on the floor, so I thought I'd take the opportunity to talk again a little bit about our immigration bill. this has been such a gratifying process to me because it's been bipartisan from the start. In fact, I've been telling people it's not even that it's been bipartisan, it's been nonpartisan. And the work in the Gang of Eight, which led to the work in the Judiciary Committee, which has led to work on the floor, has been the way I think this place ought to operate on a whole host of issues, from energy, as the presiding officer cares a lot about that, to infrastructure, to the budget issues that I was just talking about with the senator from Texas. And it is important for people to know this is a bipartisan bill, because I think people are fed up with the partisanship in this town, and they don't feel like it reflects the way they live their lives, and there's a reason for that. It doesn't. You know, this place is sort of decoupled from the priorities of the American people, and I think this is an effort, among others, hopefully, to recouple those priorities. And I've been interested in the objections to the immigration bill since the beginning. First, there was the objection that it was actually going to drive up our deficit. Well, not surprisingly, we learned from the Congressional Budget Office that this bill actually would create the most significant deficit reduction of any piece of legislation we've considered here, certainly that we've passed here. $197 billion in the first 10 years, $700 billion in the second 10 years. Even in Washington, $1 trillion is still a lot of money. And that's what we heard, both because people that are now not paying taxes would be paying taxes, and also because of the economic growth that would be generated if we could restore the rule of law to our immigration system and to this economy. So that was an objection. That objection was answered, not by me, but by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. The second objection was that the legislation was not going to get a fair airing, that it was going to be rushed in the dead of night. And I don't like doing work that way. There were 8 no votes on the fiscal cliff deal at the end of the year, and I was one of those no votes. One of 3 Democrats that voted no, not largely, but partly because it hadn't had any process and it was in the middle of the night. This bill, by contrast, had 7 months of negotiation among 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans who were consulting with their colleagues. It had 3 weeks to go through the Judiciary Committee, markup that had 160-some amendments, many of which were accepted. 41 Republican amendments were accepted to this bill. It came to the floor for the debate that we've had over the last 3 weeks. I realize that the amendment process is jammed up, and I'm sorry about that, because I think people ought to be able to, including the presiding officer, ought to be able to offer the wise amendments that they have and the not-so-wise amendments that they have, at least in my opinion. But there certainly has been an open process for this bill. So that objection, and sometimes you hear people say, well, it's just like health care all over again. I was here during the health care bill, and I can tell you this process looks nothing like that process. So then there's a third objection, which has been that, well, there's no border security in this bill. First of all, that wasn't even true of the Gang of Eight bill. We had substantial border security, and I was taking as my lead what John McCain, Senator McCain from Arizona, said was important, and what Jeff Flake from Arizona said was important. 2 border senators working hard to resolve these issues in our group, and we made a substantial investment in that bill in border security and technology, even in fencing in that bill, because I think it's a reasonable expectation, not of Republicans, but of the American people, that our border should be secure. Certainly the people in Colorado believe our border should be secure. And so when others came and said, we'd like to vote for this bill, but we'd like to do more on border security, I not only was open to that, I supported that. And now the bill before us has incredibly substantial border security, 700 miles more of fencing. We double the number of Border Patrol agents on the border. One of the senators said to me that we're at a point now where there's a Border Patrol agent at every 1,000 feet on the southern border. One might ask whether that's a wise use of resources, but it was important for people to come on to this bill. So I don't think any reasonable person looking at this could say that border security has not been addressed. So then what are the objections to moving forward? And you begin to hear people say, well, it's the path to citizenship. We don't like that part of the bill. That was a core principle for the 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans that started this negotiation. And it's been a core principle for a lot of people that have voted for this bill. A very important reason to pass this legislation is to resolve the situation that the 11 million people that are here illegally find themselves in. And the pathway to citizenship is the right way to do it. This is an amnesty. This has to be earned. People have to pay a fine. People have to learn English for the first time in our history. People have to pay their taxes. It takes 10 years to get a green card, and then 3 years after that, you've got to pass background checks all along the way so that we know who the people are that we want to stay in this country and who the people are that we want to have leave. I see the senator from Louisiana is here, so I will wrap up. But let me just say to my friends that think that some lawful status that doesn't include a pathway is useful to this country, I would say to them to look at countries all around the world that have created a subclass of people, secondary, not even citizens, just a subclass of people with no attachment to their culture, no feeling that they're ever going to participate in their civic or political institutions or meaningfully in their economy, no chance to believe that their children or the children after them are actually going to make those contributions as well, and say, does that look like the United States of America to you? That's not what the founders had in mind. You hear a lot of cheap talk about the founders these days around here. That's not what the founders had in mind when they wrote into the Constitution that it was our responsibility as a body to deal with immigration. And so I hope people will consider that objection as well now, take a look at the Senate bill, and I hope support it. And with that, Mr. President, I know the senator from Louisiana was scheduled to speak, so I will yield the floor to him.
Mr. President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank my colleague. Mr. President, I wanted to speak about an amendment I have filed on this immigration bill that I've been working hard to get a vote on. It's certainly not my only amendment filed, but it's a top priority. And it's the Violence Against Women and Children Amendment, Amendment number 1330. Now, Mr. President, we've heard a lot of promises and a lot of rhetoric on this issue from many people, including the Gang of Eight. What I've found distressing as I've actually gotten to read the bill, and let's always remember one of the great lessons of Obamacare, read the bill, read it before we vote, is that the bill, the details, the exact language doesn't match a lot of that rhetoric. This is one glaring example of that. One of the earliest and most important promises by the Gang of Eight was that in this amnesty process, folks who were guilty of serious crimes would not be eligible. In fact, they'd be deported. That's why in the bipartisan framework for comprehensive immigration reform that the Gang of Eight released in January this year, they said this, quote, individuals with a criminal background or others who pose a threat to our national security will be ineligible for legal status and subject to deportation. Illegal immigrants who have committed serious crimes face immediate deportation, close quote. Well, we can all agree with that. Problem is the details, the text of the bill doesn't agree with that because it does not include several serious offenses, particularly against women and children. And so my amendment is simple. It is to beef up, to strengthen this part of the bill by including Violence Against Women Act offenses as crimes that would disqualify someone from being granted amnesty and which would trigger immediate deportation. Now, these are serious, violent crimes: sexual assault, stalking, domestic violence, sex trafficking, dating violence, child abuse and neglect, also elder abuse. So specifically, Violence Against Women Act offenses. These are serious. These are violent. These are against some of the most vulnerable in our society, and these clearly, in my opinion, should be disqualifiers. So that's what the amendment would do. Now, VAWA, which we debated and voted on a few months ago, has widespread bipartisan support. More than 200 national organizations, more than 500 state and local organizations expressed support for that bill. Great majority of us here voted for it. I voted for it. So we should certainly follow up with that, to that rhetoric and to that vote by making sure that these serious offenses in the Violence Against Women Act are disqualifiers to amnesty in the immigration bill. Now, Mr. President, this is not my only amendment, and this amendment not getting a vote so far is a frustration. It's a frustration of a lot of us with regard to a lot of amendments. This immigration debate is enormously important. This bill is enormously long, well over 1,000 pages, and so far we have had 10 roll call votes on amendments. 10, period. That's one amendment per, 120, 130 pages. That's ludicrous, Mr. President. That's not the full, robust amendment process that we were promised for months and months and months by both the Majority Leader and the Gang of Eight. So I hope I can get a vote on this amendment, and I also want and expect a vote on my other filed amendments. I have many, but I've narrowed that list down. So with that, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that my Violence Against Women and Children Amendment number 1330 be made pending and eligible for a vote.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Colorado.
I object.
Objection is heard.
Well, in closing, Mr. President, I find that very, very disheartening. This is a big subject. I agree with the proponents of the bill that this is a big problem that needs fixing. It's a big subject. It's been on the Senate floor for 3 weeks. It's well over 1,000 pages long, and we need more opportunity for serious debate and amendments than we've gotten. And as soon as a path to passage was identified late last week, as soon as that happened, the amendment process was basically shut down. It continues to be shut down today. This important amendment being denied a vote is an example of that. I find it very regrettable, and I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President,
Senator from Vermont.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we have a major crisis in our country today in terms of the high cost of a college education and, in addition, the incredible debt burden that college students and their families are facing. This is a major problem in Vermont. It is a major problem in every state in our country. And the job of the United States Senate is to understand that crisis, to improve the situation, to lessen the burdens on students and their families, and not to make the situation worse than it is today. Mr. President, at a time when we need the best educated workforce in the world, hundreds of thousands of bright young Americans who are qualified to pursue a higher education, who want to pursue a higher education, do not go to college. And they do not go to college for one very simple reason. They cannot afford to go to college. According to a Pew study of 18 to 34-year-olds who haven't completed college, 48% say they cannot afford to do so. Higher education for middle-class families and working-class families is simply too expensive, and this is an issue we must address. What does it say about our country when hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young people who want to contribute, who want to do more with their lives, cannot get the education that they need? It deprives them from, in many cases, making it into the middle class, and it denies this nation the intellectual capabilities that they have. Further, millions of young people who graduate college are saddled with an incredible debt burden which radically impacts their lives. In America today, the average debt for a college graduate is over $27,000. In my state of Vermont, it's about $28,000. That is the average. That means there are many young people who have more debt. For those who go to graduate school or medical school or dental school, the debt can be many times higher. Last year, I talked to two young dentists in the state of Vermont. They are in debt to the tune of over $200,000 for the crime of having gone to dental school. Now, this horrendous debt burden impacts the lives of young people in many ways. It can determine, and this is a hugely important issue, the profession that they choose to enter. How can you become a teacher, a child care worker, a legal aid attorney, or even a primary care physician if the salary you earn will not enable you to pay off your debt and take care of the obligations that you face? So in other words, this debt is forcing many young people into professions which are not necessarily their love. It's not what they wanted to do. It's what they have to do in order to earn money to pay off their debts. This debt burden, this crushing debt burden, determines when many young people will live and whether or not they can even afford to buy a home. How do you go out and buy a home if you're spending 20 or 25% of your income paying off your student debt? This debt burden on our young people even determines, in some cases, whether or not they get married and have kids. Mr. President, the higher education debt burden that the American people are now carrying at $1.1 trillion is now higher than our credit card debt and is having a significant impact upon our economy. In fact, the Federal Reserve and the Department of Treasury have both issued warnings that high levels of student loan debt could drive down consumer demand and have a negative impact on economic growth. In other words, if you're spending all your money paying off your debt, you're not buying goods, you're not buying services. So high level of student debt is having a negative impact on our overall economy. According to a report released by the New York Fed, and this is really important for people to hear, student loan debt has nearly tripled since 2004, in less than 10 years, nearly tripled. Total student loan debt in the United States now exceeds $1.1 trillion. Average student loan balance has increased 70% since 2004. Mr. President, if we do not act immediately, the subsidized Stafford loan program will see a doubling of interest rates on July 1st, in a few days from now. Let me repeat. If Congress does not act immediately in the next few days, the subsidized Stafford loan program will see a doubling of interest rates on July 1st. The rates will rise from 3.4% to 6.8% for subsidized Stafford loans. This would be a disaster for millions of students and their families all over our nation. We must not allow that to happen. At the very least, we must immediately pass legislation that extends for several more years interest loans on the Stafford loan program at 3.4%. Meanwhile, as part of the higher education legislation, we must begin work on a long-term solution that guarantees the students of this country that they will be able to attend college and graduate school and not be burdened with suffocating debts. Mr. President, as we contemplate long-term new policy on student loans, one thing that we should be very clear about: the federal government should not be making a huge profit off of the needs of low-income and working families who utilize the Stafford loan program. That is simply wrong. And in fact, that is what we are doing today. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal government makes a substantial profit today from student loans. For loans made this year, in 2013 alone, that profit is expected to exceed $50 billion, and this is higher than the profits made by ExxonMobil, the most profitable company on earth. Mr. President, as I hear every day on the floor of the Senate, we are reminded that we live in a competitive global economy. And I hear every day from my colleagues that the United States is not doing all that we can do in terms of educating our young people in such areas as science, engineering, technology, and math. And in fact, in the immigration bill that we're debating right now, there is an effort to bring hundreds of thousands of workers from abroad, presumably because we do not have enough workers who are knowledgeable in terms of engineering, science, math, and other technologies. What sense does it make if we are doing a bad job now in educating our young people in general and specifically in the STEM areas that we make it harder for kids to get a college education? What sense does that make? And I should mention, Mr. President, that countries all over the world understand this point, and they are doing a much better job than we are in investing in their young people in general and specifically in higher education. According to a report released just yesterday by the OECD, the United States was one of the few advanced countries in the world that did not increase its public investment in education. In fact, the vast majority of advanced nations do everything possible and a lot better job than we do to make higher education more affordable for all of their students. A couple of weeks ago, I had the ambassador from Denmark coming to the state of Vermont to talk about what goes on in Denmark, and people ask him, well, how much does it cost to go to college in Denmark? And the answer is nothing. Not a penny out of your pocket. It's paid for out of the tax base. And in fact, students there get a stipend. But Denmark is not the only country which makes sure that all of their kids can get a higher education, a graduate school education, a medical school education, without having to pay for it out of their own pocket. Austria, Finland, Norway, Scotland, Sweden also do the same. In Canada, which is an hour away from where I live, average annual tuition fees were $4,288 in 2010, roughly half of what they were in the United States. And yet the OECD says Canada is one of the most expensive countries for a student to go to college, half the costs of where we are. Germany is in the process of phasing out all tuition fees. Even when German universities did charge tuition, it was roughly $1,300 per student. So here's the bottom line. The bottom line that all over this country, students and their families are facing crushing debts, radically impacting their lives and the choices that they make. And there are some in the United States Senate who say, yeah, that's pretty bad. How can we make it even worse? How can we raise interest rates for our kids? Make it harder for them to go to college. Make sure that when they get out of college, they are more deeply in debt. And I say no. I think that's absurd. I would remind you, Mr. President, that when Wall Street banks borrow money, you know what they're getting it for today? Less than 1%, 0.75%. And we are talking now about families having to spend 6%, 7%, 8%, 9% in order to send their kids to college, to help our country, to make it into the middle class. That's absurd. We have got to understand that a well-educated population is perhaps the most important thing that we need as a nation if we're going to survive in a highly competitive global economy. So, Mr. President, let me conclude by saying this. This Congress has got to act, and act immediately, to prevent the disaster that we're looking at from happening, and that is a doubling of interest rates on the Stafford Loan Program, which will go from 3.4 to 6.8% on July 1st. Short term, we've got to extend that 3.4% interest rate. Long term, we need to make certain that every kid in this country, regardless of income, can go to college and leave school without a crushing financial debt. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator from Colorado.